scratch your head and think, why? What was that achieving? And I think I would have scratched my head for an awful lot longer if it weren't for the fact that in our morning services at the moment, we are going through the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, we've seen a lot of things that feel like these two stories. We've seen God introduce himself to his people as I am, which is a more literal translation of what he says there when he says, it is I in verse 20. We've seen in Exodus God rescue his people from slavery in Egypt, and that was commemorated through the Passover, or at least part of it was, and verse 4 says this all happened at the Passover. We've seen God accomplish that rescue through his miraculous control over the water of the Red Sea when he split it in half. We've seen God in the wilderness provide bread miraculously for his people through Moses. It's the bread, they called it manna, that came down from heaven. And Jesus here in these two miracles, the miraculous feeding and the kind of water miracle, is deliberately, I think, evoking all of that and saying, the God that you met in the book of Exodus, here I am. Everything that Exodus taught you about God is true of me, Jesus says. I am powerful to save people from the slavery that they're in. I can bring people all the way to the promised land that awaits them. And on the way, I can provide people with everything that they need. I can satisfy people, and therefore they can trust me. That's what Jesus is saying about himself as he evokes these two great episodes from the story of the Exodus. And so Jesus can give you what you're hungry for, because he's God. He's got all power, even over the water, even over bread, and he uses that power to provide for his people. That is who Jesus is claiming to be. The crowd who are there, they think that in that story back in Exodus, it was Moses who provided the bread, which is why in verse 14, they think to themselves, oh, brilliant. Well, this is the prophet who come into the world. And they're thinking, verse 15, well, maybe he'll do the same thing as Moses and get us some political liberation from the Romans as well. They think in Exodus it was all about Moses. But if you look over to verse 32, Jesus says, it's not Moses who's given you the bread from heaven, but it's my Father. The person who provided the bread is God, and that is Jesus' claim for himself. Now, in Exodus, God was bringing his people through the wilderness to a promised land where they belonged. And in the end, kind of full, complete satisfaction comes only when Jesus has finished his work of getting us home to the promised land of heaven with him. That's where we get full satisfaction. But there is a glorious measure of satisfaction that we can have now, and we will find it not at the end of a rainbow or at the top of a greasy pole or inside a pay packet or in the arms of her or him. We won't find it within our own hearts. We can't achieve it. We can't find it by searching for it. We will get it from Jesus as a gift. The Exodus God, the one who owns everything, can give us what we need to know satisfaction. Maybe you're here this evening precisely because you are searching for it. Don't know what it is, but you know that you're looking for it. The search could be over this evening, because Jesus is saying, I can give you what you're hungry for. But what's the thing? What is it that he gives us? Well, here is our second point. Jesus is what we're hungry for. Jesus is what we're hungry for. Verse 25 and the verses that follow is where the crowd start getting a little bit jumpy about what Jesus is saying. We've seen verse 24, there's still loads of them, and they are really keen to get close to Jesus. But in verse 26, Jesus explains, sort of unveils why they like him. He says, you're looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. In other words, he says to the crowd, you're looking for me because you're basically interested in free food. and possibly some political liberation as well, we saw in verse 15. And both of those things, free food, they're great things so far as they go. But Jesus has got something better than that to offer. Verse 27. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life. Do not work for food that spoils. And there's a message for each of us to take to heart. Don't work for food that spoils. Don't live for something that you are going to lose or that you might lose. In the end, all the stuff in this world that we might pin our hopes for satisfaction on are like the contents of your food recycling bin. Spoils. It was delicious once. You paid money for it. And now it's flies and bin juice. And that is the way of the world. The job you are so desperate for, it gets restructured out of existence. The political cause that you spend your life fighting for is regarded as problematic by the next generation. The fame you built is forgotten. Don't work for food that spoils. And therefore, I think Jesus is saying, don't come to me as one way of getting food that spoils, because I've got something better I want to give you. He's got something to offer that endures forever. Verse 32 and 33, he says, it comes to you from God, just the same way as the bread in Exodus did, from God. So verse 34, the crowd say, effectively, oh, yes, please. Please, can we have some of this everlasting food? It sounds absolutely terrific. Verse 35, I am the bread. Come to me, and you'll never be hungry. Believe in me, and you'll never be thirsty. So what is the bread that Jesus gives? Jesus. He's the provider and the provision. He's the giver and the gift. Jesus is the thing that Jesus offers to us. And he says it's what we most need. What does it mean for Jesus to call himself bread? I guess if in our culture you were to call yourself bread, you wouldn't be saying very much particularly. It's nice, it's unexciting, it's functional. It's a bit less exciting than a bagel, in my opinion, but you're not saying very much. In the context that Jesus was speaking into, to call yourself bread is to say that you are the essential to life itself. If people don't have you, they die. And I don't know if you noticed, life is a repeated word throughout the chapter. You don't have bread, you don't have life. And so that is what Jesus is saying. If you don't have me, in the end, you have had it. He's essential. But as well as saying he's essential, I think Jesus is saying he's enough. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. He's enough. He's saying, I will satisfy you. You won't be hungry if you've got me. To use C.S. Lewis's language, Jesus is saying, I am it. He gives us himself. Or more specifically, he gives us his flesh. If you have a look on to verse 51. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. I was messing about with this bagel earlier, but if I had needed it, these bagels would have given me life. And they would have been able to do so because some other stuff had died first. Guess there was a wheat plant that somebody cut down and crushed up and whatever else you do. It was broken into pieces for me, for my life. And the same is true of Jesus. Died so that we could have life. Everybody dies. Even Jesus' followers, even the people who came to him on this day for eternal life, they died. And the Bible teaches that death is a judicial thing. Death is a judgment from God on the human race for having turned away from him. But Jesus came to take that sentence on himself so that as he died, anybody who receives him receives life that is death resistant. His flesh, his body was broken apart for us so that we can have life and never hunger. Well, this is all very nice, somebody says, but I am not actually convinced that Jesus is really what I'm hungry for. All this business about his flesh is all fine, but I think what I'm hungry for in life, to be honest, is just getting my health back. Preachers say things like, we've all got a God-shaped hole in our hearts, but to be honest, I think the hole in my heart is shaped quite a lot more like a first in my degree, or like a promotion, or like a spouse. And my question is, are you sure? Because history is littered with people who thought they had found the thing that would meet their needs, and then they got it, and it turned out their needs were deeper than they thought. Turned out that they only really wanted the research position because they wanted to feel significant, and then they got a measure of significance for a while, but not really. When all along, Jesus was saying, you are so significant that I died for you. To use the food image, it's as though we always think that what we're hungry for is McDonald's, and you may identify with that illustration. That's what we always think we're hungry for, McDonald's or Popeyes or whatever it is. But the more of that kind of stuff that you put in, the more that it becomes obvious that that is not what's meeting your needs. That's not where they lie. You think you're hungry for nuggets, when really what your body is hungry for is for some vitamins and minerals or something, I don't know. We'll find that the things we think we're hungry for are actually just kind of scratching the surface. The hole in our hearts is bigger than we think. And in the end, each of us will die and will meet our Maker. And at that point, if not before, it will be very clear that all the health and all the influence and all the degree certificates in the world won't help us. And the only thing that will is the fact that Jesus gave his flesh for us when he died on the cross. Maybe there's others in the room thinking, well, I am a Christian, I have accepted Jesus, and I still feel hungry. I hear your neat and tidy solution, but there is not a lot of satisfaction going on here. It's tempting to think, well, maybe verse 35, Jesus was slightly overstating it. Or maybe he's very good at post-death stuff, but if I want bread now, if I want satisfaction now, I need to sort that out for myself. Or to kind of put the same problem another way as a question, how can I appropriate the life that Jesus' flesh gives? How can I go from the fact that Jesus died on the cross 2,000 years ago to me not being hungry for satisfaction anymore? I think the answer is the same as the answer to the question, how do I go from food being on a plate to food giving me life? The answer is, I eat it. And again, that is a repeated idea in this chapter. Verse 51 we looked at. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. Or verse 53, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Or it's there in verse 54, or verse 56, or verse 58. Eat. That is, take on board in a deliberate, repeated way. One of the reasons that we take communion is that as we do that, we are acting out the fact that I need to come to Jesus and take him on board. Not that I automatically do that by eating this bread, but I'm enacting, I'm starting to get my head into the fact that that's what I need to do. I need to come to him and receive him and feed on him. Both in communion and in John 6, the way that I feed on him is by trusting him, by coming to him. Believing in him is the language that Jesus himself uses here. By deciding daily, I am going to come to Jesus and ask him for more of him in my life. Ask him for his help. And as we do that, we'll experience more and more him satisfying us and meeting our needs. Perhaps if you're here and you're a Christian who is still feeling very hungry, one question might be, well, have you stopped eating? Have you stopped feeding on Jesus? He offers himself to you again today. But just as we finish, we kind of circle back to where we started and note that when Jesus offers himself to us, he does so not as a kind of snack, not as a light bite. The previous French president, François Hollande, was nicknamed flambé, which is a soft, sweet, squidgy treat, which was an insult, I believe, towards him. That was the nickname people gave him. Not Jesus. There's nothing soft and squidgy in this chapter, is there? Verse 60 says, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And the word hard there is sometimes used of food. It's tough, it's difficult. And it is a hard teaching, isn't it? Jesus' teaching here says that our needs and hungers are bigger and deeper than we realize. Saying that we can't sort ourselves out. He's saying nothing other than Jesus will do the job. But for all the people who that day found Jesus' teaching too difficult, the issue wasn't lack of evidence. They'd been fed by him miraculously. They'd seen the feeding of the 5,000. The issue was whether they were willing to follow the evidence where it led. And in the end, in verse 68, Peter asked the question which I've often come back to when I've experienced doubts in faith. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Who else makes claims like this and can back them up? Where else are we going to go to find satisfaction if not this man? Jesus comes to a hungry world and a hungry you, hungry me. And he says, on the strength of his divine godlike power, he says, I can give you what you are hungry for. He says, I am what you're hungry for. If you'll come to me, feed